we're going to kick it off really with an introduction to the cooperative topic. So this, we organized this session really for folks who are maybe new to the cooperative model, maybe have less experience than some others in the cooperative model, but also we hope it's useful to people who are working in cooperatives, but maybe only see one space of the cooperative ecosystem in Central Appalachia. So we'll be thinking more broadly about that ecosystem today. Okay. So let's start out with the foundational question, really, which is, what is a co-op? When we talk to audiences, really throughout the region, the word co-op actually means different things to different people in those audiences, depending on what they've had experience with in the cooperative community. So we like to think about this question first in what is a cooperative, which it's actually a little bit more complicated than you might think. It's a little trickier. So I have up here on my screen two definitions of the cooperative business model. So when we're talking about cooperatives, we are typically talking about the cooperative business model. So this is a way of organizing business. And the International Cooperative Alliance is a non-governmental organization that advocates and organizes and lifts up the cooperative community globally. So you can read their definition of the cooperative model here on the screen. You can also read the definition from the US Department of Agriculture. This is kind of a simpler definition. It encompasses really three main concepts that is typically how we conceptualize the cooperative model. So there's user ownership. So cooperatives are owned by the people who use them. There's user control. Cooperatives are controlled by the people who use them, by their members, typically in a one member, one vote fashion, which we'll talk, I think, a lot more about today. And member benefit is really that third kind of tenet of the cooperative definition, which really means that cooperative businesses are organized to benefit the people who use them. Their primary purpose is not necessarily profit maximization for the purpose of profit maximization. So that's a little bit different than some other business models that we're used to, and it creates different ways for cooperative different aspects of operating a cooperative that can be a little bit different. So those are really the three major tenets that we think about as we're kind of defining the cooperative business model. Again, that's user ownership, user control, and user benefit. Those are really kind of the three things that highlight the cooperative business model. There are many definitions of the cooperative business model. There are many principles of cooperation, which Ryan will talk more about. And one thing we want to highlight throughout this presentation is that the cooperative business model is diverse and it is responsive to community needs. And so these definitions are definitions from specific perspectives on cooperatives, and there are other definitions of cooperatives that many of you may know or want to throw in the chat or ask questions about, but feel free to make this a learning opportunity. So if we think about what types of businesses cooperatives are, really we should be thinking about all types of businesses. Cooperatives operate in every sector, really, in the US. If we look at data from the University of Wisconsin Center for Cooperatives, just to get an understanding of what that national cooperative economy looks like, you can see the geographic dispersion here on the map. There are about 64,000 co-ops across the US. They employ just over 850,000 people, and they're really in sectors that are diverse. So we see cooperatives in sales, marketing, and production. So that can be anything from an agricultural marketing cooperative that maybe markets specialty crops on behalf of agricultural producers, to cooperatives that do purchasing and sales on behalf of retailers. So it looks different depending on the community that it's serving. You also see many financial services cooperatives. So credit unions are mutually owned businesses that fall under the cooperative umbrella. There's also cooperatively organized specialized lenders, and so they would fall in that space. You also can see social and public service cooperatives. One area that we see cooperatives historically playing a large presence is in schooling, homeschool cooperatives. You can see social services in terms of home health care and a number of other types of cooperatives. And then, of course, we can't forget the utility sector and energy, which we'll be talking a little bit more about today in the Appalachian context. So electric cooperatives are owned by their consumer members, and a number of other applications in the utility space, including water, telephone, and telecommunications as well. So that's just kind of an overview of what the cooperative ecosystem looks like nationally, so that as we orient to Appalachia and Central Appalachia, that can give us some context. So the other way that cooperatives are defined is really by the principles that they operate by. And Ryan is going to share with us what those principles are here in the US.
Yeah, so when we talk about co-ops, we're also often talking about like a larger community of businesses that are existing kind of in this space of cooperation. And they all will operate according to these 7 shared principles, or most operate to these seven shared principles. There are some that have 10, but they really root in these 7 that were founded in around the 1840s in the Rochdale Cooperative, which is kind of known as the first cooperative formed by weavers in England. And so they really focus on tenets that have really been brought on throughout history. So the first is voluntary and open membership. And that is kind of opening up this cooperative. You need to, be able to be joining and have really an open membership where people are, of any background, creed, race, religion, are kind of voluntarily and open to membership to the cooperative. 2 is democratic member control. So a lot of people, when we learn about cooperatives, you hear 1 member, 1 vote. And depending on the cooperative, that may not necessarily be always true. As I learned, being relatively new to this job, cooperatives, if you've seen one, you've seen one. All are different to the community need, to the people. But traditionally, we like to think of democratic member control as being a vote and having a say. So you are able to use your voice to have that 1 vote in the cooperative. Now, that doesn't mean that your 1 vote is going to overweigh anyone else's, that, that you really have that power, that 1-person power, and keeping democracy as kind of the key in that concept. 3 is member economic participation. So with a cooperative, you are putting a piece of your economic profit, a piece of your kind of skin in the game. You're putting this into the cooperative. You are putting your money, your own hard-earned money, into this business, and with the hopes that you'll see returns on that investment. And so that is really as you get into as you become a member, many cooperatives have either membership fees or fees surrounding your ability to join the cooperative, regardless of what that might look like. And those are really important to kind of keep your kind of core together. You want everyone to have the same amount of involvement that they can have in this cooperative. And part of that is through economics. So your 4th tenet is autonomy and independence. In cooperatives, you really want to, or most cooperatives, this cooperative principle really focuses on having kind of this space where you can create your own thing. You can be your own cooperative in a way that an autonomy allows you to really vocalize and speak about your own independent views and how they can come together as a group and form through that.
One other way I like to think about this, Ryan, is that as a cooperative business grows and matures, or really kind of just operates, the goal is to keep the control with the members. It's about that second principle of democratic member control. And as the co-op grows and does business with other organizations or forms joint partnerships or is out in the world doing its work, it is still retaining the autonomy of the members who retain that control. So that's just one way I like to think about it as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point, that, remaining this, putting democracy kind of at the forefront of this cooperative process. And that's a great point, Hannah. So 5, and kind of the 5th principle we're looking at, is education, training, and information. And hopefully that's where we can be more beneficial to any, startup co-op that's already existing. We also manage a cooperative of co-ops throughout the mid America, I guess. So the Mid-East, Midwest, where we really help with those education activities. Part of being in a cooperative is having the knowledge to make those decisions. You do get a vote, and that is so important to be able to not only know what a cooperative is, how it works, why you're even there, why you're a member. A lot of those education points are really to get people, 1, familiar with the cooperative model, but 2, comfortable using that vote in a way that is going to benefit that cooperative as itself. And really, information in this sense is really all about being able to come together, being able to cooperate in a way where everything is effective, efficient, and beneficial. The education and training really there is as I've learned, one of the most important parts, I think, to running an efficient cooperative and effective cooperative for your kind of needs, community, and all of those.
Yeah, I think that's so true, Ryan. And sometimes it's the education is about the cooperative model, and sometimes the education is about whatever the business of the cooperative is. So we'll see a number of types of cooperatives in our conversation today. And one that I think about often is in agriculture, dairy marketing cooperatives play a large role. So marketing the milk on behalf of member farmers. And one thing that's really important in that type of cooperative is the quality of the milk that farmers produce. And so thinking about how dairy cooperatives help educate and train their farmers on creating better and higher quality products, not only strengthens the individual farm, but it helps the cooperative do its work of marketing on behalf of those farms. And so that education and training is about strengthening both the member as well as the cooperative as a whole. And we can think about that too in terms of worker-owned cooperatives, which we'll talk more about, but helping and training worker owners to manage the business that they are managing is an important component of many worker-owned co-ops.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, those quality types that you mentioned, Hannah, are really good examples of how you can see the education and the importance of education outside of just knowing what a cooperative is and how they function and why that's also important. The 6th cooperative principle is partially what our talk will be about today. So cooperation among cooperatives. Sometimes we call that the cooperative economy, and how cooperatives are kind of interwoven in each other. That is part of what I found most fascinating about cooperatives, is that typically when you find one, you find an interlocking system of connections between other cooperatives into one cooperative. And these kind of cooperative principles really stress this need for, cooperating among other individuals. And even at a larger level, if a cooperative is doing what you are doing somewhere else, is there a way you can contact? Is there a way you can learn? Is there some sort of synergy? Are you all crossing paths somewhere and don't even know it? I think that 6th principle has been really interesting, especially when, cooperation among cooperatives, of course you're cooperating. That's kind of your intention. But when you put that intentionality behind actually cooperating, not just saying, oh yeah, well, we're going to cooperate with other cooperatives, that it can show a major difference. And 7th is concern for the community. And I think Hannah mentioned earlier, cooperatives are really responsive to community needs, and that's their intention, is that there is a need or some sort of problem arise. How can it be fixed? Can it be fixed through all of us? Is it fixed through one person? And within cooperatives, the answer is typically, we need to cooperate with each other. But that community concern is really at the heart of that. They're answering a question that they see a hole in the community. A lot of times what I think about, I guess from a kind of historic example, but these still exist today, so they're still relevant, is the need for either grain merchandising, grain marketing, grain mills, elevators, collecting, agricultural goods in small communities that maybe aren't going to be able to get to a larger hub, but when, a grain co-op can come together and farmers can say, we need this in our community. We need this for, we need, as in the farmers need this, then that kind of concern for community can come up in different ways. Of course, it can also show up in, seeing a social need that needs addressed that has maybe an economic, advantage, whether that's a community garden or, access to more local foods, and how can we do that with each other. But I do think that there are, that's kind of at the root of these cooperatives, is what, the concern for the community, not only as, social, as needing things in the community, how can they help outside, but why their cooperative is there.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Ryan, is that the purpose of a cooperative is to be responsive to community needs. And that's the next thing that we're going to talk about, really, is I think it helps orient us to the cooperative economy, is thinking about why people start cooperatives. I really think that helps people understand the cooperative model at kind of a foundational level. One of the main activities that we do at the Center for Cooperatives is helping entrepreneurs and community members who are experiencing some kind of challenge or recognizing some kind of opportunity, explore whether a cooperative might help them solve that problem or take advantage of that opportunity. And so I think that thinking through that can help really kind of wrap your head around the model. And one way that we often do that is by asking a question. And Ryan kind of posed that as he was talking about the principles. But as we're thinking about where cooperatives thrive and what cooperatives do best, this is kind of the question that comes up, and is a question that is not original to us. Really, this comes out of like the economics literature around cooperatives, right? Cooperatives are about kind of market integration in some ways. So can you do something better as a group than you can individually? And so that's a question that we pose to groups who are thinking about the cooperative business model. So that can you do something could be marketing, it could be purchasing, it could be starting a new business enterprise with worker-owned members. It could be providing some kind of service in the community that's not available for some reason. So that's something I want to point out is a pretty big category, right? It's pretty broad, and we'll see how others have answered that in Central Appalachia. The other way to think about cooperatives that I often find helpful is to compare them to other types of businesses, maybe business models that we are more familiar with or have had more experience with. And so we've talked about those main tenets of cooperatives being user ownership, user control, and user benefit. But if we take a look at what that means in comparison to other ways of organizing economic activity, a la these business entity types that you can see on your screen, we can really see that play out in terms of a cooperative being owned and controlled by the people who use it. In comparison, for example, if we're thinking about a sole proprietorship or a partnership, maybe Ryan and I decide to go into business together to start a coffee shop, then the ownership is with Ryan and I. Whereas, or it could be in another format, of course, through LLCs or corporations. In a co-op, perhaps we would flip that and we would think about the users of our coffee shop perhaps becoming the member owners, where perhaps it's a community-owned coffee shop. Or maybe it would be that Ryan and I and some of our other colleagues and friends get together to make that a worker-owned coffee shop. And we, as the workers in that business, are then the member owners as well. So that's one way that cooperatives differ from other types of organizations. Of course, we've talked about this business purpose as being another major way that cooperatives differ from other types of businesses. So as we mentioned, in a cooperative, the business purpose is really meeting member needs, right? So that's kind of the first and foremost. What is it that the members need that the cooperative can do better serving as a group, rather than the members trying to do that on their own? Whereas in other types of business entities, the goal is often to earn a return on the owner's investment. And often the goal is to maximize that return. So that's not always the case, but it is often the case in the way that other businesses are organized. That's not to say that co-ops can't provide a return on member investment. They certainly can, but that is not the primary purpose that drives the cooperative business model. And then, of course, if we look at nonprofits, really their purpose is often to provide some type of service or information or education even. Voting, we've mentioned, co-ops typically utilize a one-member, one-vote system. That's how they uphold that democratic member control principle. In other types of organizations, other types of entities here, ways of forming businesses, typically the way those are organized is that control is based on monetary investment. So the number of shares I vote is directly correlated with the amount of money I've invested in the business. In the cooperative, that's not the case. So if Ryan and I and a couple of our friends started a cooperative, and perhaps one of us invested more money in the business than the others, that would not mean that that individual has more votes than the other person. The members get one vote each, and really that helps to keep control spread across the organization and democratic, rather than kind of coalescing around one really powerful shareholder, somebody who's invested more money than others. And then we see management and governance. So one thing that we often talk about with groups who are thinking about cooperatives is how they're governed. They're owned by members, they're controlled by members, but how does that actually look in practice? And the way that works in practice is that cooperatives are governed by a board of directors who are typically elected from and by the membership. So one of the main ways that cooperative members exercise their control in a cooperative is through electing their board of directors, who will then represent them in the policy setting of the organization, in hiring and supervising management, if there is hired management, in responding to and understanding the risk that the cooperative is facing, in overseeing the financial assets. Really, it's a similar function to other boards, maybe nonprofits or corporate boards, but the way that individuals are elected to the cooperative board is different. So it's, again, through that one member, one vote system, typically from and by the member owners of the cooperative. And of course, that's pretty different than other ways of organizing business, where the management and governance is vested in the control of the owner, right? So if Ryan and I went out as partners and started a coffee shop, it would be Ryan and I making decisions and communicating between ourselves to make those decisions. Whereas if we had a larger cooperative, the decision-making would look quite different. And it would be, again, involving all of those member owners, typically through an elected board of directors. So what are the advantages and limitations? So I'm a big fan of the cooperative business model, but that doesn't mean that I think it works all of the time in every situation. So let's start maybe with the limitations here. One thing that we talk with groups about who are thinking about starting cooperatives is whether it makes sense to and the cooperators are willing to share control and profits. Because as we've just talked about, financially speaking, all of the member owners of the cooperative are entitled to the profit sharing in the business. They're also entitled to their vote in the business and to exercising their voice and control in the business. So that can be a big question, whether people are willing to do that and whether it makes sense to do that. As we've talked about, cooperatives are organized for member benefit rather than for profit maximization imperative. And sometimes that can make the financing a little bit different. It just looks different than some other types of businesses. In some ways, it can be challenging to raise the startup capital for a cooperative, but that is certainly, it's not impossible and it's changing. There are organizations and institutions that are thinking about how to do that more effectively, and there are more of those all the time. But as I mentioned also, if Ryan and I started a coffee shop, the decision making would be with Ryan and I, whereas if Ryan and I and 5 of our friends started a worker-owned coffee shop, the decision making in that instance would be different and perhaps more complex. So sometimes this structure is complex to wrap our head around and to manage the functioning of. Notice I didn't say impossible, I just said complex. So what are the advantages? Where do cooperatives work? One thing that cooperatives do really well is allow for knowledge sharing across the membership. This is something we see often in startup co-ops that we can talk a little bit more about. Really, cooperatives are about pooling. They're about aggregating and bringing together resources, whether that resource is knowledge or capital or purchasing power. They're about coalescing around that aggregation and that pooling. So cooperatives can help members reach economies of scale. They can help them be more efficient in whatever it is that they're doing. It can help them gain market access. So sometimes through scale, we reach new market channels. Perhaps it's bargaining power that we're aggregating and pooling in order to be more effective in the supply chain. Maybe it's reducing individual risk. It's a lot less risky if 22 farmers work together to invest in processing equipment than if 2 farmers did so. And then, of course, there is member control. That means cooperatives are accountable ultimately to their members and that they're organized for member benefit. So that is one of the advantages that we see. So if we look at the economic literature, and really the area that I'm more familiar with is agricultural economics literature around this. Sometimes the economists say that cooperatives are well suited to instances where there are market failures. So for the economists out there, that can be your mantra. So Ryan's going to orient us into the cooperative economy in Appalachia, and we're going to go through some case studies.
Yes, so diversity of the region, of the people, of the geography is kind of where we want to start with our introduction to Appalachia. I think most of us are from the region, so it's no surprise. But 25 million people live in Appalachia. 9.8% of those Appalachians are Black, and 5.3% of those people are Latinx. And so that community diversity is not always reflected and rarely reflected in depictions of Appalachia, but in a part, the cooperative economy is really beneficial to diverse groups of people, including those in the region. So when thinking about, not really being able to capture all of those 25.7 million people, we want to just focus on Central Appalachia, which we've defined as Eastern or Western Pennsylvania, Southeastern Ohio, West Virginia, and Eastern Kentucky. And this is a map from the ARC, so it's all of the Appalachian region. But with our focus, we really want to talk about kind of the cooperative economy that exists in this area, because to many, and hopefully it's not a surprise, but it may be, there are many cooperatives in the Southern Appalachians and in the North Northern Appalachian. So we want to focus here, and we want to focus on the diversity that exists within this cooperative economy. That our diversity is not only in people, is not only in socioeconomic status, is not only in race, but is also in cooperatives, types, styles, and structures.
Yeah, that's a good way to say that. So we hope that you're aware of other cooperatives than the ones we talked about today. That would be a great plus. Yeah. We can't talk about all of them, but we hope we hit on kind of a broad spectrum to help orient you to that diversity, but with the awareness that we just don't have time to talk about all of them.
So a little bit about Appalachia's cooperative history starts in probably a space that isn't necessarily a written history yet, at least. We're going to work on that. But when you're thinking about traditions of cooperation, in that, we're not really just saying people cooperated to survive, because that's been the history of people since there were more than one person. So we really wanted to focus, especially in this region, on cooperative principles, in those traditions of cooperative principles. So for instance, a lot of these cooperative principles really kind of resurge at moments of social and economic transformation. And what we mean by that really is at moments when industry was changing, when people were making more money than before, when new people were coming in. And we looked at three distinct periods to kind of get down into really good examples of how Appalachia's kind of harnessed these cooperative principles. So the first was an early migration and this first economic transformation. So with the introduction of kind of capitalist networks, as white people first ventured into the Appalachian Mountains, we see these networks of cooperations as a mean of survival. And that means, towns cooperating together to have solutions. We talk about community hog slaughters. We talk about, grain grown collectively because there wasn't maybe not enough area where one was together. A lot of people who actually lived in Appalachia and didn't just own the land had to work together to keep their own society where they wanted it. The next kind of era we think about major social economic transformation in Appalachia is from 1865 to 1900. I describe this as the Hatfields and the McCoys to Hannah. But in a sense, this is a major social transformation that's happening in Appalachia. And community resilience is incredibly important at this time. They are working together to provide stability to the community. As kind of things are industrializing, markets are industrializing, people who are looking for and looking to maintain their lifestyles that they've had here in Appalachia are really working together to do so. And this era of history, although, in popular culture marked as rather turbulent, if you look at the people living here, they were working together probably more than they had in many other eras. And even, kind of a major example of that, I'll get to in a minute, becomes kind of these cooperative economies popping up all over West Virginia, southeastern Ohio, eastern Kentucky, and western Pennsylvania that are working together in similar fields. So this type of community resilience and cooperation is all in response to this kind of transformation, social, economic, moving from a traditional economy to an industrial economy. And lastly, when we think about kind of how these are traditions of cooperation, I really think about fighting for economic power. And if there's one thing that, especially in more modern times, and Appalachia kind of gets this name of being a people worth fighting for themselves, fighting for this economic power in community, whether that is through labor, whether that is through environmental justice. Communities throughout Appalachia have worked in these cooperative networks to gain power and really start kind of developing these networks of communication. I see somebody put into the chat that there are multiple books about it. The one I'm most familiar with that kind of talks about this same era is Jessie Wilkerson. She has a book. She has a book, and really thinking of the 60s and 70s labor struggles as part of this kind of long history and long tradition of cooperation. We can go to the next one, Hannah, if you want.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, you're good. So this is kind of the example I mentioned a little bit earlier. So this is this actual picture is of multiple cooperative glass plants that exist in Clarksburg, West Virginia. Existed, I should say. This was right around 19, I believe that it's 1885 to 1910. And so the city of Clarksburg is pretty well connected, is not too far, I believe, from Morgantown. So there's a lot of railroads coming through it. And as they kind of see this transformation of an industrial economy, glass plants there who are making window panes and various other activities are seeing a transition from handcrafted to industrialized processes. And a lot of these very skilled workers are pushing back against this. And their main source of this economic kind of assertion of their own power, of their own skill, is to form a cooperative. Now, most of these cooperators are immigrants. They have come to Appalachia to specifically make glass, and that's kind of their skill and their trade. So as they come together, they start forming this cooperative network. You see cooperative stores come in Clarksburg. You see towns nearby become cooperatives. You see their glass plants become cooperatives. And then you see them talking to one another, even if it's in kind of little bits and pieces in newspapers. You see interactions between multiple cooperatives in this one place in West Virginia. And this is just a little bit, gives us a window into this cooperative history that, as you'll see next, still lives in Appalachia today.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. I think that our goal there is really to just say that the modern cooperative economy in Appalachia has a long history. So we're looking at a snapshot today, but these traditions of cooperation are not new in this region. So if we think about kind of our first broad area, we wanted to talk about where cooperatives are active in the region. The first one that comes to mind for us is agricultural cooperatives. That's kind of our area of specialty, but of course, that's not the only place where cooperatives operate. But in the region, we see cooperatives being used to support sustainable food systems, to enhance producers' efficiencies, to make them more profitable, to provide to create to provide for their livelihood in a way that is more attainable. So if we think about really just the economics of agriculture in Central Appalachia, for example, in Ohio's Appalachian region, there were just under 30,000 farms in the region in 2017. They had about $1.5 billion of products sold in that year. In West Virginia, there are about 23,600 farms in the same period, with about 754 million in products sold. One kind of telling statistic about the agricultural economy, really in the nation, but also in Appalachia, is that about 8% of producers, of farmers in West Virginia that in 2017 were 34 years old or younger. It's really an aging profession. In Ohio, that number was about 10% of farmers less than 34 years old, younger than 34 years old, I should say. So if we think about cooperatives, we can think about them, agricultural cooperatives in this region, we can think about them in a number of ways, from supporting young farmers to increasing perhaps the profitability of farming in the region through enhanced marketing or better efficiencies. So in 2017, there were about 1,871 agricultural cooperatives in the US. So those are cooperatives in farming, ranching, and fishing. They had on average about 973 members each, but there is really a wide diversity within that. And so I wanted to share one example from the area region that I also was born and raised in the foothills of the Appalachian region in Ohio. So this is the Buckeye Valley Beef Cooperative. This is a young cooperative founded in 2016 by 3 family farms. Young family farmers. I'm not going to reveal their ages, but I will say that they are young farmers. They were really interested in capturing more of the food dollar from their farms. So they were livestock producers, and they were all marketing beef or livestock or cattle independently, sometimes direct to consumer, but really it was a challenge for them to market into like retail grocery stores and into larger channels because of the consistency of product that they needed to have year round. That was harder to do as an individual farm, a little bit riskier to do as an individual farm because it requires increased production. And so these farmers were really interested in finding a way to enhance the amount of the food dollar that they were receiving on their farm, to improve their livelihoods, to get locally raised food into their local communities through grocery stores and direct to consumer. So they started a marketing cooperative. They market beef, as their name says. They've been doing that since 2016. They market directly to consumers. They market into local independent grocers. They do online marketing, and they work together really to access new market channels that they were not accessing individually in order to essentially increase their on-farm income from their beef production. So really, I think this group showcases one of the co-op members as quoted as saying, "We can do together what we cannot do apart, sell to wholesale meat suppliers, grocery stores, and directly to consumers year round." So that's really what this cooperative has provided to these members. And again, thinking about a region of the state where the average net cash farm income is about $13,000 annually, between $13,000 and $14,000 annually, that's really important, particularly for young producers. So that's one way that we see cooperation in Appalachia in the agriculture sector. But we don't have time to talk about them today. Another way that we see cooperatives in the Appalachian economy is through worker-owned cooperatives. And we've talked about these a couple of different times today, but worker-owned cooperatives are identified by the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops as values-driven businesses that put worker and community benefit at the core of their purpose. And when we think about the member owners of a worker cooperative, it is what it sounds like, it's the workers. There's great diversity in worker cooperatives. You can have worker cooperatives from manufacturing businesses to childcare to retail to construction, really anything you can imagine. And there are probably worker co-ops operating in that space. It's a small sector today, so we know nationally there are about 465 worker co-ops in the country. Interestingly, they have an average wage of about $19.67 per hour, according to the last kind of census that the Democracy at Work Institute did in 2019. And they bring in an estimated $505 million in revenue. Again, that's kind of looking at that national community. But worker cooperatives, they're about employment for their worker owners, but so much more. So there's, of course, evidence that worker co-ops are empowering people to share in the control of their workplace, that they're empowering worker owners to build their business skills. There's tentative evidence that communities that have higher rates of employee ownership, of which worker cooperatives are one type, have better health outcomes, they have better educational outcomes, they have higher social participation than communities that have lower rates of employee ownership. So the benefits of worker-owned cooperatives and the forms that they take are really, really diverse. Not something that we can cover, of course, in our time today, but something that we want to think more about. So you can see a photo here of a worker-owned music company in the region. And Ryan will talk about another type of worker-owned cooperative as well. But we also have Casa Nueva. Shout out to anybody from Casa who's on today. I saw some familiar names in the Athens area, or if you know Casa. It's one of, I think, one of the oldest worker-owned cooperatives in the region. It's a worker-owned restaurant in Athens, Ohio. Became worker-owned in 1985 by a group of 8 workers. Today, they have an extensive membership process, a really developed and robust member engagement and member control process. Their information is also on their website, so super interesting to take a look at if you have time. They also do quite a bit of work with local producers to locally source their food. So that's kind of one of those examples we see of concern for community and building community. So I think today the estimate we saw, Ryan, or the latest number we saw was they have about 21 worker owners. Now that doesn't include all employees. So there can be employees who are not worker owners, but about 21 worker owners at CASA today. If others in the virtual space have updates, feel free to share. In West Virginia, Unity Cafe in Parkersburg is a worker-owned coffee shop. Unity started in 2017. I might be off by a year, and I apologize for that. So it was an opportunity for baristas who were skilled workers to actually own the enterprise that they were working in. So it started with 4 worker owners and is focused on providing a space for those worker owners in their community there in Parkersburg, West Virginia. So those are just 2 examples of worker-owned cooperatives. These just happen to be in the food service space and in restaurants, but Ryan's going to talk actually about a different space where worker co-ops are active.
Yeah, so I am going to talk about industrial cooperatives, which, like we mentioned, worker-owned cooperatives are incredibly diverse, and industry just happens to be one of those spaces where they become incredibly applicable. So within this kind of manufacturing and industrial sector, 11% of worker-owned cooperatives are focused in manufacturing, and in 25% of all worker owner cooperatives are focused in industrial fields. That includes transportation, aggregation, distribution, trucking, things like that, all kind of fall into a similar realm where they're working with in the manufacturing process. In 2013, worker cooperatives outperformed their peers in kind of overall, and this is from a Democracy at Work study. They found that manufacturing actually, the net profits of that was about $10.8 million, and their profit margin was 10.1% in comparison to other industries that they had studied within other worker owner kind of their pool of worker ownership. So another thing to kind of think about with these is, not only are they creating local manufacturing and industrial jobs throughout Central Appalachia, but they're also increasing local economic power. And so this money that these manufacturing worker-owned cooperatives are bringing in are going back into the community, whether that's through ownership, whether that's through this return on their investment, or through the, like Hannah mentioned, increased wages, that you're seeing more local economic buying power, local economic return, this concern for the community. It all kind of ties into increasing a local economic power, not only for the people, but for the cooperative itself. This is just one example of an industrial cooperative from our region. So this is the West Virginia Wood Products Cooperative. We can go to the next one. So our example of this one, or one of our examples, is Opportunity Threads, which is in Western North Carolina, near Morganton. And so this actually had been an existing business and then became employee owned in 2008. And so there is a really interesting intersection there where, there was a lot of work from this community, that there was a need for this to still exist, this manufacturing employer. So they began pulling resources with help from other social charities, as well as kind of really instrumental in bringing them together, that they formed this worker cooperative. And their view of worker ownership is really about a tool for community resilience. And their focus is economic justice in rural Appalachian communities. This area of North Carolina in particular actually has a incredibly high population of Guatemalan immigrants. There's actually a really great book about Morganton itself called The Maya of Morganton, which focuses on the importance of their labor there and also the lives that these people are having here and this need for economic justice in communities of color in Appalachia. And it's really an interesting book if you ever get the chance to look it up. Opportunity Threads also has a really interesting environmental and social responsibility that they really focus on providing high qualities, quick turnarounds, accommodating, anything you would kind of want from kind of this manufacturer. But they're also really thinking about those social responsibilities that the cooperative has. So next, we're going to move into another type of cooperative, which are credit unions. Credit unions may be more familiar. I didn't realize until I started here that a credit union was a cooperative. To be honest, I was like, oh, another credit union. It was just kind of like, oh, that has to be just a type of bank. And after kind of learning a little bit more about them in my job here, but also for this, I think that there's just they play a really important role in communities, especially underserved racial communities where there are opportunities to come together and serve each other rather than, wait for someone to bring an economic opportunity to you. Credit unions are kind of opening doors to serve underserved communities. So, credit unions in particular, as of September 2020, their total estimates in the United States were about $1.79 trillion. And they had 123.7 million members. So as being a member of this credit union, they're kind of amassing everyone in the U.S. And within West Virginia itself, there were 379,000 members. Within Ohio, and this is for the entirety of Ohio, there were 3 million members. So there are a lot of credit union members, which is why there are so many of them as well. So if you want to go to the next slide. This is an example of a credit union. Actually, if we were at work, it would be right across the street. But the Atomic Credit Union was actually founded in 1955 and was associated with the atomic plant that's in Piketon. And as the atomic plant kind of waned, the credit union really kind of blossomed. They grew across southeastern Ohio. There are multiple branches throughout multiple counties. They really started to expand in the 90s and just kind of grew from there. And they're really, they go into schools. They're doing a lot of economic education, really part of that kind of training people to know more, learn more, part of those cooperative principles. And they're working in the community as well. We can go to the next one. So the next one that we focused on, and this is kind of our kind of round robin of cooperatives in Appalachia, are energy cooperatives. And so energy cooperatives' intent are to really supply competitively priced energy to customers or to be able to get energy or, to customers, whether that means it's the first time, especially, there's a long history of rural electric co-ops in Appalachia, and it, traces back into the 1930s. But energy cooperatives are always taking a new spin and moving forward as we kind of move forward. So 56% of the nation's landmass is actually supplied electric by cooperatives, and they serve 42 million people in over 2,500 US counties. So they're all over the place, and they might not even be in places that you're familiar with. I know that there's an electric co-op that supplies, not too far away from me that my family all have that I had no idea was a co-op because it doesn't say co-op, but their kind of purpose there, how they started was this electric cooperative. And I think it's really good to kind of find out more about those. So types of common energy cooperatives, as I mentioned, rural electric, there's also solar alternatives and water and hydroelectric cooperatives. So from 2010 to 2019, co-ops renewable energy capacity increased 151%. So that basically means it went from 4 gigawatts of electricity to 10. And that's really kind of where my interest kind of went into, is kind of seeing how active they were in making these alternative energy platforms. So our example, our last kind of example here is actually from Pennsylvania Solar United Neighbors. So Solar United Neighbors is a national organization. I chose Pennsylvania because most of their cooperatives actually exist in the Appalachian region already, which I think is fascinating. So Solar United Neighbors kind of works together to promote and provide clean energy. So they work in a closed cooperative system. So they find these people to work kind of cooperatively together. They work together and then they close. But then if there's interest again, they can open a new one, which I think is also a really awesome part, that interest can kind of encourage more cooperatives. Actually, in Western Pennsylvania, so in the Appalachian part of Pennsylvania, they've actually had 73 installations of solar panels, which is just kind of really interesting. And across various counties, they all are kind of working together to provide these alternative energy sources. Yeah.
So as we're wrapping up here, we could talk about cooperatives for a very long time, but we want to be cognizant of our time together. As we've talked about, Appalachia's cooperative economy is diverse. It includes cooperative efforts across industries, across geographies, across communities. And we see those cooperatives doing work in their communities, like creating employment, responding to specific community needs. Perhaps those needs are financial or marketing of specific types of products, or access to services like broadband or electricity in the past. They support workplace democracy, and they have this great potential to harness members' economic power. We know from a study by the World Council of Credit Unions that only about 10% of cooperatives fail after their first year in business, which is compared to about 60 to 80% of other businesses using other types of models. And then the longevity really over the long term, if we look at 5 years out, about 90% of cooperatives are still operating well. Only about 3 to 5% of other types of businesses and other types of models are still operating. So this model really does have resilience in the way that it can respond to community needs. Now, that doesn't mean it's the easiest model to get started, or the model is complex, but there are, what we hope you saw today, diverse applications and really a lot of opportunities to really help Appalachia's economy move forward through the cooperative model. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I think I saw that there was a hand raised. So Vernon, and Vernon shared Everything Co-op. So Vernon, I think, is the responsible for the podcast, Everything Co-op. So check that out. And I think, Vernon, I can allow you to talk here. Let me try that, if you would like. You have a question or anything to add to the conversation? And feel free to put that in the chat as well. Again, if you have questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A. Feel free to chat. Here's our information if you would like to reach out to us as well.
We did have one question. Did you answer that? Sorry, I was just making sure.
Yes, there was a question in the Q&A about groupthink in cooperatives being a possible limitation. Great question. I haven't seen any specific data about that point, but member control is a complex thing. So making that work is a complicated matter. So I'd be interested to learn more about that. Great question, Ophelia. Thanks for joining us today. There will be a recording. Again, if you'd like to reach out to us, here's our contact information. Glad to have you. And we'll stick around to answer some more questions. Feel free, if you'd like to throw us a question in the Q&A or the chat, we'll stick around. I'm going to stop recording now.